My son began to be embarrassed by me because I worked as a janitor to provide for him. Sometimes the deepest cuts aren't from anger, but from a quiet, almost invisible erasure. What does it feel like to watch your own child look straight through you? As if you're just part of the furniture, or worse, part of the help. It's a humiliation that can break you, or it can forge you anew. I still carry the sting of that moment, a raw memory that flashes vividly in my mind whenever I try to pinpoint where everything fell apart. I was standing in the doorway of some opulent event space, my work clothes still carrying the faint scent of disinfectant from my shift. My son, Liam, then just a boy, was at a fancy party, and he looked straight past me, his eyes devoid of recognition as if I were just another anonymous staff member, not his mother. But that moment wasn't born overnight. The roots of that particular pain ran deep, back to a time when I mistakenly believed that simply surviving together meant we were on the same team. Back when I thought love could erase class divides, rather than exposing how desperately some people wanted to run from their origins. I married Mark when I was 24, still holding on to the naive idea that hard work was a linear path to a better life. I envisioned some cosmic ledger, meticulously tallying every extra shift, every skip treat, promising eventual reward. Mark had a rough upbringing, with parents who seemed to collect failed relationships and overdue bills like hobbies. He joked that marrying me was his first adult decision. My own background wasn't glamorous either, just the boring kind of struggle, cramped, low income apartments, and a mother who scrutinized every coin before buying anything not on sale. By the time we exchanged vows, I'd already been cleaning office buildings for years, walking into pristine lobbies before dawn and leaving long after everyone with a badge and a title had gone home. Mark was waiting tables, living off tips and caffeine. We crunched the numbers, and while it wasn't pretty, it was enough for a tiny apartment, groceries, and endless debates over which cheap streaming service we could afford. When I discovered I was pregnant, it wasn't some cinematic, joyous revelation. I sat on the edge of the tub, staring at a cheap corner store test, my throat constricting and my chest expanding with a strange mix of fear and wonder. Mark just sat on the bathroom floor, head in his hands, quietly murmuring that we'd make it work somehow. We didn't have the luxury of me staying home, not even for a little while, so I kept working through my pregnancy, scrubbing toilets and emptying bins, my back aching, my ankles swelling like balloons by the end of each shift. Daycare costs were astronomical. We did the math 3 different ways, and each time the numbers mocked us. There was simply no scenario where we could afford childcare and still eat. So we made the only logical choice. After Liam was born, Mark quit his job to stay home, and I took every single hour my cleaning company offered. People love to label that kind of decision modern or progressive when it's made by couples in chic apartments with healthy savings. For us, it was pure, cold arithmetic. A few months later, I caught a small break. A larger cleaning company acquired some of the buildings I already worked in and offered me a full-time contract. Better pay, more predictable hours. It wasn't a huge leap, but it meant I didn't have to worry about being short on hours each week. Eventually, they made me a shift lead, a fancy title for having keys, and slightly more responsibility for almost the same money. But that small raise back then felt like a miracle. By Liam's third birthday, we'd moved beyond mere survival. We had a careful stability. Bills were mostly paid, fresh fruit wasn't a luxury item, and I could buy him a small toy without a 10-minute internal debate. He was a boisterous, curious kid shadowing Mark around our apartment. A part of me ached, missing all his firsts, but another part swelled with pride, knowing I was the reason the light stayed on. In those early years, Mark would call me his hero for working so hard, and I believed him. It sounded like gratitude then, not a dark foreshadowing. But when Liam started school, things began to shift slowly, insidiously. With Liam gone most of the day, Mark started pacing our apartment like a caged animal. He constantly talked about feeling useless, trapped, weird for being an adult man without a job title. I understood. I really did. I knew what it felt like to measure your worth in paychecks, even if your title was the woman who cleans the bathrooms. So when he said he wanted to go back to work, I agreed before he even finished the sentence. We meticulously rearranged our lives. I shifted my hours, taking earlier or later shifts so I could pick Liam up from school most days, help with homework, and actually attend school plays instead of just hearing about them secondhand. For a while, this new routine felt good. Mark came home invigorated, full of stories from coworkers, a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, and I finally got to do those mom things I'd secretly envied. I'd show up at school in my uniform, still smelling faintly of disinfectant, and Liam would run into my arms, not caring what I looked like or how tired I was. It filled a deep, empty space within me. I took on more housework on weekends, telling myself it was temporary, that once we both found our rhythm, it would balance out. I thought we were building something stronger together. I didn't realize he was already beginning to look over the fence at other lives. Mark eventually landed a job as an assistant instructor at a high end gym across town. The kind of place where people pay ridiculous amounts to run indoors while the rest of us walk everywhere because gas is expensive. He'd come home talking about the clients like they were characters from a glossy TV show, detailing their clothes, their vacations, how they treated extravagant spending as utterly normal. At first, it seemed like a strange fascination, a glimpse into an alien world. But gradually, his tone shifted. Our cozy apartment became cramped, our old car an embarrassment. And my cleaning job, which he once bragged about for keeping us afloat, became something he'd sigh about, as if it were a temporary phase I should have outgrown. If you just pushed for that supervisor position, we could move sooner, he'd say. Or maybe if you picked up a couple of weekend shifts, we could finally get out of this neighborhood. He framed it like our future, but the pressure settled squarely, crushingly on my shoulders. At the same time, he started staying out later, claiming networking with coworkers or clients. I found myself putting Liam to bed alone more nights than not. When Liam asked where his dad was, I'd repeat whatever flimsy excuse Mark had given me, trying to ignore how hollow it sounded even in my own ears. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when Liam stopped asking for his father at bedtime, but that silence was its own stark answer. I kept telling myself Mark was just in a phase, adjusting to a new world where everyone seemed to own 3 houses and a boat. I believed he'd eventually remember the life we'd built, not the one he thought he deserved. Looking back, I see the crushing naivety. But then I was too busy juggling schedules and counting tips in my head to see the resentment quietly replacing gratitude in his heart. The night everything shattered began like 100 others. I was half asleep on the couch, still in my work clothes, the TV flickering. Liam, 7 by then, slept in his room, his school drawings taped to the wall. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. When the door finally opened, it wasn't just late, Mark was wrecked. He'd brought the chaos of whatever bar he'd been in straight into our living room. I smelled the alcohol before I saw his face. He swayed slightly, his eyes glassy, drunk and mean. I asked him where he had been, my voice etched with exhaustion, not anger. Instead of his usual lazy excuse, he let out this ugly, unfamiliar laugh and declared he was done pretending. My first thought was relief. He was finally admitting a drinking problem, or that the job was too much. But what he truly meant crashed over me in broken, slurred sentences. He wanted a divorce. With a bizarre, rehearsed calm, he dropped the bombshell. He'd been seeing one of the gym clients for a year. A year. 12 months of me working double shifts, rearranging my life while he was meticulously constructing a secret life with a woman who, as he so helpfully added, actually understands the kind of life I want. She was older, he said, around 60, successful, with her own business and rental properties. Charismatic, well connected in a way he had never experienced. He loved how important he felt beside her, how she made him believe he could be more than just the kid from a broken home who married the cleaner girl. He described her with an almost proud tone, like he was reading from a rose shirt. All I could think, standing there in my stained work shirt, my hands shaking, was that he'd chosen someone who would never have to wipe crumbs off a cheap kitchen counter at midnight. Someone who already had the life he used to say we would build together. When I finally managed to ask about Liam, about what he thought would happen to the child who'd waited for him at that door for 7 years, he shrugged. Actually shrugged. He said Liam would be better off with me, that he wasn't cut out for parenting anyway, and didn't see himself fighting for custody. The worst part, the absolute gut punch, was his admission that his grand plan with this woman didn't include Liam at all. Not even on weekends. She wasn't looking to start over raising somebody else's kid. She wanted to travel and enjoy her money. He said it like it was a neutral fact. Like Liam was an optional add on he could simply skip. Something inside me cracked in that moment, not the soft heartbreak of minor disappointment, but the deep, ugly snap of realizing the person you built your entire life around was willing to treat your child like inconvenient luggage. So we divorced. There were no dramatic courtroom battles, just basic paperwork, a custody agreement that confirmed his exact wishes, and a judge who, looking to our incomes and schedules, granted me full physical custody with visitation for him if and when he felt like showing up. He was supposed to pay child support, but he treated it like a suggestion. Some months it arrived, others it didn't, and the expensive gifts he occasionally sent were always louder than his responsibility. I walked out of that building technically free, just Liam and me against the world. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like escaping a burning house with only my child and the clothes on our backs, the lingering smell of smoke clinging to everything. The next few years were a blur of early mornings, late nights, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones. I kept my cleaning job, took every extra building offered, doing everything to ensure Liam had what he needed. I was the one up at dawn packing lunches, the one sitting in tiny cafeteria chairs at school meetings, the one learning to fix leaky faucets from video tutorials because a handyman was a luxury. His father, Mark, drifted in and out like some visiting celebrity, appearing every couple of months with expensive sneakers, fancy gadgets, or tickets to events I barely recognized. He decided his role was the fun parent, swooping in with gifts while I handled all the boring, unglamorous parts of parenting. He'd pick Liam up in a borrowed car or one that certainly didn't scream tight budget, whisk him off to some fancy dinner or activity, and bring him home full of stories about how amazing everything was over there. I tried to focus on the positive, on the fact that he was showing up sometimes, that Liam needed both parents. But it was impossible not to feel the sting when my son came home comparing their lavish outings to our regular nights of pasta and cartoons. One year, around Liam's 12th birthday, Mark actually showed up at the small party I planned in our cramped living room. It was just a few of his school friends, simple food I'd stayed up late cooking, a homemade cake that leaned slightly to one side, the whole we do what we can vibe that had always been our reality. Mark walked in, surveyed the scene with a little smirk, and in front of everyone asked if I was still cleaning toilets for a living or if I'd finally found a real job. I laughed it off because what else could I do in the middle of my kid's birthday party? But inside, I felt like he plunged a knife into every sacrifice I'd ever made. After the party, Liam cornered me in the kitchen. He asked, very seriously, why I didn't try to do something better if I hated my job so much, because Dad said I could make more money if I had more ambition. I wanted to scream that the only reason his father could stand there making jokes was because I had been busting my ass for years. Instead, I just told him the truth. It was honest work, it kept us afloat, not everyone gets a career they love, and I chose stability for him over chasing dreams I couldn't afford. He listened, but I could see in his eyes that the damage was already done. Mark had planted the idea that I was small, limited by choice, not circumstance. Later that year, there was an important school event and award Liam was really excited about, and Mark promised he'd be there. Liam kept checking his phone that night, glancing at the door every time someone new walked in. I sat beside him, trying to hold my own disappointment together, repeating the usual lies. Maybe traffic is bad. Maybe parking is impossible. All the things we tell kids to shield them from the full weight of adult unreliability, Mark never showed. Instead, he sent some expensive new gadget via delivery service, with a short message about being caught up with work. Watching Liam open that box, trying to act happy while his eyes kept flicking to the empty seat beside him, was one of the few times I genuinely wanted to throw a gift out the window. Not long after that, in the middle of one of our inevitable arguments, Liam blurted out that he'd rather live with his dad because, at least there, I don't feel poor all the time. It was like being punched in the lungs. I'd known the visits, the gifts, the glamour stories were creating a chasm between us, but hearing it out loud from his mouth made me realize that the man who'd walked away from us had somehow still managed to take my kid with him in a different, more insidious way. As Liam moved into his teenage years, everything sharpened. Mark officially married Victoria, the wealthy woman. Suddenly, there were pictures all over social media, them in matching outfits at chic restaurants, Liam in clothes I definitely didn't buy, trips to places I'd only seen in travel magazines. The narrative they meticulously crafted was that Victoria was opening doors for him, giving him opportunities I never could. That she was a fairy godmother stepping in where the poor, tired mom had failed. She paid for an expensive course he wanted to take. They took him on trips during school breaks. Every visit to their grand house added another layer to the story he was telling himself about what a good life looked like. I just kept doing what I'd always done, working, showing up, trying to be consistent, even when I was exhausted, bitter, and wanted to scream every time I saw another picture of Liam smiling next to them, in some place I couldn't even pronounce. The tension between us grew like mold in a damp corner, quietly at first, then suddenly everywhere. One night, during a particularly bad argument about him coming home late from their place and snapping at me over something trivial, he finally said it plainly. You hold me back. You're trying to keep me in this tiny life because you're scared. If you really love me, you would want me to move into that world, not cling to this one. I wanted to tell him that what I wanted, more than anything, was for him not to turn into the kind of man who treated people as stepping stones. That the life I was scared of wasn't the one with money, but the one where love was a performance, where respect was always conditional on status. Instead, I just told him I loved him, that I was doing the best I could. He rolled his eyes as if I'd said something pathetic. Somehow, the years sped up. Middle school bled into high school. I watched him grow taller, feeling smaller in his eyes. He turned 18 and announced he wanted to become a barber. I was genuinely proud. It was practical, creative, and didn't depend on his father's wife's bank account. I scraped together the money for his course, worked extra hours, cut corners everywhere. When he graduated and started working, I stood there taking pictures with my old phone, thinking, hoping this might be the beginning of us finding each other again. That hope didn't last. Once he was earning his own money and spending more and more time at Mark's house, the calls to me got shorter, the visits fewer. Our relationship became this fragile thing, existing mostly through quick text messages and occasional holiday dinners where he seemed restless, half present. I was still technically his mother, but increasingly, I felt like an old teacher he'd once been fond of, someone from a chapter he'd already closed. By the time he turned 24, he was engaged to a woman I barely knew, Chloe. I'd met her in passing twice, always at events organized by Mark or Victoria, where I felt like a guest of a guest, someone who'd received an invitation by mistake. The engagement announcement came via a group message that included me and a host of strangers. The photo, well, as taken at some scenic exotic location from a trip I hadn't even heard about, the wedding planning kicked into full gear, and I watched it all from the periphery. I wasn't involved in choosing the venue, the dress, the colors, any of the things you imagine a mother might help with. I didn't expect to pick out centerpieces, but I thought maybe I'd at least be asked about the music or where I'd like to sit. Instead, I learned through an offhand comment from a relative that the seating chart had me tucked into a side table with some distant cousins, nowhere near the front rows reserved for immediate family. When I asked Liam about it, he said, "Oh, we just thought it would be easier this way. Less drama," as if my feelings were a scheduling problem, not something that mattered. He also told me not to arrive too early on the wedding day because they didn't want people hovering while they got ready. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Then came the blow that shattered something I didn't even know was still intact. One afternoon, talking about the reception, I casually asked if he'd thought about the mother son dance. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He'd been thinking of skipping that tradition altogether, he said, because it felt kind of outdated and he didn't want anything too sentimental. I swallowed my disappointment, told him it was his day and his choice, and tried to convince myself that maybe it was for the best, that I didn't want to stand in front of everyone swaying awkwardly while they judged my dress. A few days later, I was at a small gathering. Chloe was talking to one of her friends, excitedly going over the reception playlist. The friend mentioned how sweet the mother son dance was going to be, and Chloe, without thinking, blurted out, "I know, and he picked the perfect song for his dance with his stepmom. She's going to cry for sure." I froze. I'm not proud of what I did next. I didn't confront anyone then and there. I just quietly slipped outside, waited until I was completely alone, and texted Liam a simple question: "Who exactly are you planning to dance with?" At first, he tried to deny it, got defensive, said I was misunderstanding things, and that people were gossiping. But when I laid out exactly what I'd heard, he finally admitted it. He'd chosen to do the special dance with his stepmother, Victoria. He said she'd been there for him in his most important years, that she'd helped him with opportunities, that she made him feel comfortable in the circles he moved in now, and that he didn't want to make things weird by ignoring her in front of everyone. He even threw in some line about how our relationship was private and complicated, and he didn't want to put that on display. I can't fully describe what that felt like. It wasn't just jealousy or hurt pride. It was this deep, cold, gut wrenching humiliation. Like he had taken every sacrifice I had ever made and quietly, publicly handed the credit to someone else. I told him as calmly as I could manage with my handshaking that it hurt me deeply, that it felt like being erased. He responded with something about how I was making it all about me on his day. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from his childhood. All the nights I carried him when he had a fever, all the mornings I left before dawn to keep us afloat. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I simply could not force myself to sit in that room and watch him publicly replace me. So I decided I wasn't going to the wedding. It wasn't a dramatic, rage fueled decision. It was a slow, painful conclusion that kept coming back, no matter how many times I tried to talk myself out of it. When I told him, he reacted, exactly how I knew he would. Accused me of being selfish, said I would ruin his day, that people would talk, that I was proving everyone right about me being difficult. Chloe called me separately, trying to mediate, saying she understood I was hurt, but that my absence would devastate him. I told her the truth, too, that I had been devastated for years, and that for once I had to choose myself. On the night before the wedding, I turned my phone off for a few hours. I knew there would be calls and messages, a relentless barrage trying to wear me down. I was afraid that if I heard his voice full of panic, I would cave, like I always had. I turned it back on in the morning. There were messages, of course. But what truly hit me was the call that came through just as I was trying to decide if I should shower or just stay in my pajamas all day and pretend the event didn't exist. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered without thinking. All I heard at first was frantic breathing and background noise. It was Liam, calling from someone else's phone in a full meltdown. He was sobbing so hard he could barely get the words out, but I pieced them together. Mark had shown up to the venue already completely gone, causing a scene with Chloe's parents, hitting on people, saying inappropriate things. Chloe's parents, who cared deeply about appearances, were furious, and the whole situation was spiraling out of control. Liam kept saying I needed to come, that I was the only one who could calm his father down, that I had to fix it before everything was ruined. For a second, I almost grabbed my keys. Instinct kicked in. The old muscle memory of rushing in to clean up other people's messes, to sacrifice my own safety, my dignity, my feelings, just to keep things from falling apart. But then I remembered the dance, the seat at the back, the years of being treated like an embarrassment. And I heard myself say something I had never said to him before. I can't help you, Liam. I told him I was sorry things were a mess, that it sounded awful, but I wasn't his emergency contact anymore. He begged, his voice cracking, "You're still my mother. You can't just sit at home while my life explodes." I reminded him very quietly that when he planned the event, he had made it clear who he wanted in the front row and who he did not. He tried to say it wasn't the same thing, that this was different, that he needed me. I could feel my resolve wobble a little, but then he said something about how if I really loved him, I would put my pride aside. And that was it. Pride is such a convenient word people use when they really mean the bare minimum self respect. And I realized that for him, me having boundaries simply didn't fit into his idea of what a mother was supposed to be. I told him I loved him, that I always had, but that I had spent his entire life setting myself on fire to keep everyone warm, and I was done being the designated extinguisher for problems I didn't create. Then I hung up. I broke down after that, sobbing in the hallway like I had just watched him get physically hurt, not emotionally. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor to breathe. The guilt came in waves. Maybe I should have gone, just this once. Maybe it would have been the thing that finally brought us back together. Maybe I was being cruel. But under all that, there was a calmer voice, one I wasn't used to hearing, reminding me that every time I had rescued Mark in the past, nobody had thanked me, and things had never truly changed. I didn't answer when the same number called again 15 minutes later. Eventually, the call stopped. I didn't find out exactly what happened at the venue until days later when the dust had settled, and people started Tao King. A friend of a friend who had been there filled me in, and the story was like watching a slow motion car crash. Mark had arrived already drunk enough to stumble, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. He was loud, overly friendly in that way that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable. He started hitting on Chloe's mother, making comments about how good she looked for her age, touching her arm, not taking the hint when she tried to pull away. Chloe's parents, who took everything about this wedding personally, were horrified. As if that wasn't enough, when Victoria, Liam's stepmother, tried to pull Mark aside to calm him down, he started loudly airing out their dirty laundry in front of anyone nearby. He accused her of cheating, of only being with him because she wanted someone to show off, of using her money to control everyone. He shouted about things that had clearly been festering for years, saying how she'd never wanted him involved with his old life, meaning me and Liam, and how she'd made him feel like a guest in his own house. Guests started quietly moving toward the exits, pretending not to stare. At some point, Mark lost his balance and fell into a row of chairs, knocking them over like dominoes while the wedding planner tried desperately to hold things together. Chloe's parents finally had enough. They told their daughter they weren't going to stand there and pretend this was normal, that they would not be part of a union with a family that brought that kind of chaos into such an important day. They walked out, and a decent chunk of their side of the guest list followed. The officiant refused to proceed, and the venue manager called security. The ceremony was officially shut down before anyone could even walk down the aisle. The wedding never actually happened. There was no exchange of vows, no dance, no cake cutting, just a mess of shouting, crying, and people trying to leave without getting dragged into it. Liam sent me a long email a few days after that. It was one of those messages where someone tries to do everything at once: apologize, explain, justify, blame. He wrote about how embarrassed he was, how furious he was with his father, how heartbroken he felt about Chloe's parents pulling the plug. But he also made sure to slip in a line about how if I had been there, I might have been able to stop it. He didn't write it outright as "this is your fault," but the implication hung heavy between the sentences. I stared at that email for a long time and then closed it without replying. I realized that if I responded, I would probably fall into one of my usual roles: the comforter, the explainer, the peacekeeper. I would say something reassuring about how what happened wasn't his fault, about how maybe things could still be fixed, and in doing that, I would take on responsibility again for a disaster I had not created. So I did something new, nothing. I let his words sit in his inbox and stayed silent. It felt unnatural, wrong even, but also strangely calm, like sitting completely still after running for years. The months after the canceled wedding were rough. I didn't suddenly become some glowing example of self care just because I started ignoring emails. There were days when I barely got out of bed, when the quiet in my apartment felt like punishment instead of peace, when I replayed every choice I had ever made as a mother and wondered where exactly I had lost him. I questioned that wedding decision 1,000 times. Could I have prevented the whole disaster just by showing up and babysitting my ex one last time? Would Liam still be engaged? Would he still think of that day as a happy memory instead of a nightmare? But then, slowly, life started sneaking back in through the cracks. One of my neighbors, a Wama, and I'd only ever nodded hello to in the hallway for years, knocked on my door one afternoon with a bag full of yarn. She said she was dragging me to this little community craft group she went to every week. I tried to say no, I was tired, I wasn't crafty, I had too much to do, but she refused to leave until I agreed. I showed up at that group expecting to feel awkward and out of place. But instead, there was this weird warmth in the room, a mix of women of different ages, talking over each other while their hands moved automatically, knitting, crocheting, beading, whatever. At first, I just sat there half heartedly trying to make a scarf, pretending to care. But week after week, I kept going. And without even realizing it, I started telling them bits and pieces of my life. Not the whole saga at once, but little stories. A comment Mark had made, something Liam had posted on social media, how the wedding had crumbled. They didn't judge me or try to fix it with fake wisdom. They just listened and sometimes made jokes at the expense of the men involved, which was exactly the kind of therapy I needed. Little by little, those evenings became something I actually looked forward to, a break from the loop in my head. It was one of those women who convinced me to try a dating app. I laughed in her face at first. I told her I was too old, too tired, too messed up, that I had no interest in awkward coffee dates with strangers. She rolled her eyes and said I wasn't being asked to marry anyone, just to have conversations that weren't about cleaning supplies or past trauma. We sat on my couch one afternoon and she helped me set up a profile, choosing pictures that didn't make me look like I was about to clock into work and writing a bio that was honest but not depressing. I remember feeling ridiculous, like I was trespassing in a space meant for younger, shinier people. But at the same time, there was a tiny spark of curiosity. I matched with a few men who went nowhere. Conversations died after two messages or devolved into boring small talk about the weather and TV shows. Then I matched with someone who on paper didn't look like anything special. Divorced, regular job in building maintenance like cooking, had a grown child he wasn't very close to. We started talking, and something about the way he asked questions, actually listened, didn't rush to prove anything, made me feel strangely comfortable. We messaged back and forth for weeks before I agreed to meet in person. Still half convinced he'd turn out to be a serial liar or someone with a secret family. Our first meeting was supposed to be quick, just a drink at a quiet place near my apartment, but it turned into hours of conversation. We traded stories, some funny, some painful, and he didn't flinch when I told him about Mark, about Liam, about the wedding. He didn't try to play therapist, didn't insult my son, didn't act like he was a hero for just listening. He just nodded, asked follow-up questions, and at one point, when I apologized for rambling, he laughed and said, you're allowed to take up space, right? I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in a long, long time. We kept seeing each other. There were no grand gestures, no whirlwind romance montage, just a slow, steady building of trust. David showed up when he said he would. He texted when he was going to be late. He never made jokes about my job. He didn't treat my past like baggage he had to tolerate, but he also didn't use it as an excuse to put me on a pedestal. It was normal, which felt almost exotic after the emotional roller coaster I'd gotten used to. Months went by, and without really making a big decision, David slowly became part of my daily life. Meanwhile, I heard bits and pieces about Liam through other people. The engagement was officially over. Chloe had moved on, her parents had cut off all contact with his family, and he'd moved back in, at least temporarily, with Mark and Victoria. Then came rumors that the relationship between Mark and Victoria was crumbling too, that the drunken incident at the wedding had ripped open things they'd both been pretending were fine. I didn't feel schadenfreude exactly. It was more like a numb confirmation that the shiny, perfect life Mark had chased had rust under the surface, just like everything else. Liam sent a couple more emails over the next year. They had fewer apologies and more analysis, like he was trying to build a case in his own defense. He talked about how hard it had been growing up between two very different worlds, how confusing it was to have one parent who could barely pay bills and another who made money appear like magic. He wrote about the pressure he had felt to pick a side, to prove he wasn't ungrateful to the one who paid for courses and trips. And between all of that, there were little jabs, suggestions that if I had made more money, if I had been less tired, if I had tried harder to fit into their world, things would have been different. None of those messages contained the words, I am sorry, in a simple, clear way. So I kept not answering. I don't know exactly when 5 years slipped by, but suddenly I was looking at a calendar and realizing that the anniversary of the non wedding had come and gone multiple times. By then, David was no longer just someone I was dating. He was my partner, my constant. We had moved in together into a slightly bigger place that still wasn't fancy, but felt like home. With mismatched furniture we'd both collected over the years, and a kitchen where we actually cooked together instead of eating over the sink. We talked about everything, fought some etchy, maze in regular human ways, and made up without anyone threatening to leave the country in a fit of drama. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't some elaborate surprise. It was a conversation at our kitchen table after dinner where he said he couldn't imagine growing old with anyone else and asked if I felt the same. I did. Our wedding was small, held at a modest community center room decorated by our friends from the craft group. There was no strict dress code, no seating chart, no dedicated dance for anyone's ego. I didn't invite my ex husband, Mark, obviously. I didn't invite Liam either. Part of me hesitated, wondered if that would finally close a door that maybe could still be cracked open. But the truth was, that door had been closing from his side for years. I'd heard through mutual contacts that Liam had eventually married someone else, a woman from a regular background, not rich, not obsessed with appearances, just normal. They had a small ceremony, nothing like the production the first one was supposed to be, and he hadn't invited me. I found out after the fact, and this time, the knowledge didn't stab me in the same way. It hurt, of course, but it felt more like a dull ache, the kind you get from old injuries when the weather changes. I imagined him standing there saying vows again, and I hoped in a distant way that he would treat this woman better than he had treated me, better than he had allowed himself to treat me. Every now and then, someone will mention Mark in passing or show me a recent picture of him they saw online, and I still feel that brief freeze inside, like my body has to process his name before my mind does. I don't hate him. That would be too simple. What I feel is this complicated mix of love, loss, regret, anger, and acceptance that doesn't have a clean label. The same goes for Liam. He's still out there living his life, cutting hair, paying bills, posting pictures with his new wife and their friends. He has my number. My email hasn't changed. If he ever wants to have a real conversation, one that doesn't involve assigning me a role in his personal drama, I'm here. I just won't be the one chasing anymore. As for Mark, last I heard, he and Victoria finally split for good. Apparently, all the things he used to brag about, her money, her connections, her elegant circle, came with conditions he couldn't always meet. When he lost his charm or embarrassed her too publicly, the support dried up. He went from being the shiny project to the headache she didn't want to deal with. The irony of him ending up alone after abandoning the family he had built with me isn't lost on me. But instead of enjoying it, I mostly just feel tired. He was the first person I ever thought of as home. And now he's just someone whose name makes me check that my emotional locks are still secure. I still clean offices for a living. People sometimes assume that, after all of this, I must have gone back to school or changed careers, found some new calling. But the truth is, I didn't. I got better contracts, sure, shifted to buildings that pay a little more and treat staff with slightly more respect. But I'm still the woman pushing the cart down the hallway, wiping fingerprints off glass doors so other people can walk into shiny lobbies and feel important. For a long time, I was ashamed of that. I thought my worth depended on how far I could get from the version of me who scrubbed bathrooms for a paycheck. Now, when I put on my uniform, I still sometimes feel that old sting when someone looks right through me, but it's not as sharp. I know what this job has paid for. A roof, food, the chance for Liam to take a course, the little savings account I share with my new husband for emergencies. I know the strength it took to keep clocking in when my heart was broken, when my body hurt, when my own child looked at me like I was small. I don't need anyone else to understand that for it to be real. Sometimes late at night when David is asleep and the apartment is quiet except for distant traffic sounds, I catch myself thinking about that canceled wedding. Not because I wish I had been there, but because that is the day I finally realized I was allowed to stop begging people to see me. I was allowed to sit one out, even if it made other people uncomfortable. I was allowed to let someone else's disaster unfold without jumping in as the unpaid cleanup crew. If you're waiting for some neat ending where my son shows up at my door in tears and we hug and everything is healed, I'm sorry. That's not how real life works, at least not mine. Maybe one day we will talk. Maybe we will never see each other again. Both possibilities hurt in different ways, but neither one defines me anymore. For the first time since I was 24 and holding a positive pregnancy test with shaking hands, my life is not built around what he or his father chooses to do. My life is built around quieter things now. The way my new husband laughs at his own bad jokes, the way my craft group friends always bring too much food, the way clean floors shine under fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning when nobody else is around. None of it is glamorous. None of it would make a good commercial. But it is mine. And if that makes me small in some people's eyes, then maybe small is better than invisible, because at least I can see myself clearly here, and I am finally done apologizing for the space I take up. This story, though fictional for entertainment, reflects real situations many people navigate in silence. What would you do if you were in my shoes, watching your son choose someone else, feeling publicly erased? Do you think my decision to step back from the wedding was selfish or a necessary act of self preservation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading everything. If this story kept you watching until the end, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. See you in the next video.